Friedrich von Gentz, The Law of Nations and the Decline of Internoble Solidarity, Carlsbad, 1819. Friedrich von Gentz, The Law of Nations and the Decline of Internoble Solidarity, June 25, 2017, by Noulataire Saint-Seigneur. I must say, this essay is the closest one so far to the spirit of this blog. I do not like it quite as much as the one on Jules Barny, but nonetheless it is this that best foreshadows the subjects I will be talking about all throughout. It is obvious that it is not the material situation of the people that causes the uneasiness with which society is suffering. The anxiety that agitated them was an anxiety of mind, aroused by discussions on the constituent principles of states. Those who raise these discussions often lack sincerity. They raise them deliberately, in order to produce troubles. It is a weapon which they wish to employ in private interests, and sometimes, according to their position, in political interests. They attack the very seat of the life of states by destroying their principle and organization. These men take a mask of freedom and announce themselves to the nations as liberators, so that their mission has an end. They proclaim that all princes are tyrants, that they must be resisted, that their governments are despotic, that they must be changed. To attain their end, all sorts of sophisms are employed. The most dangerous of all is to separate peoples from their governments and to put them in a position of constant distrust and hostility. This calculation of destruction is clever, for the people, always the strongest, must end by overthrowing any government whatsoever. This principle is the most dangerous of all that can be promulgated, since it engenders anarchy and renders all government impossible. In thus isolating the governments by putting kings on one side and the peoples on the other, doubts have first been raised about the nature and rights of sovereignty. Count Karl Ludwig von Fickelmont, Lord Palmerston, L'Angleterre et le Continent, 1852. That Robespierre should reign, the spirit of freedom is not yet sunk so low. The glowing flame that animates each honest Frenchman's heart not yet extinguished. I invoke thy shade, immortal Brutus. I too wear a dagger, and if the representatives of France through fear or favour should delay the sword of justice, Tallien emulates thy virtues. Tallien, like Brutus, lifts the avenging arm. Tallien shall save his country. These words come out of the character of Jean-Lambert Tallien right before the closing of Act 2 of Southey and Coleridge's The Fall of Robespierre, 1794. Thermidor sets in. What good was it, though? The glowing flame not yet extinguished was quite right. Tallien himself was a fervent Jacobin, an apologist for the September massacres, a defender of Marat, and one who voted in favour of the act that would violently end over 800 years of continuous monarchy since Hugh Capet. The same person would now become a Thermidorian. Paul Barras, too, voted for the blade. Fouché was a prime participant in the de-Christianization campaign of 1793 to install the cult of reason. Here, then, were our Thermidorians. Montagnard nutjobs who wanted to cool down a little when the guillotine was getting a tad too close to their necks. To be fair, they did attempt to clamp down on abuses done in the name of public safety, and for the first couple of years after 9 Thermidor, they capably mobilized Muscadine street fighters against sansculottist opposition. However, Jacobinism began recouping by around 1797, especially with the coup of 18 Fructidor, after the royalist plurality in the prior election of the Directory in 1795, and their prospective victory in 1797 threatened to make Thermidor a tad too Thermidorian. Accordingly, the executors of the coup proclaimed, "Open your eyes, Frenchmen, for it is high time you noticed the trap into which the king's friends and France's enemies wish to lure you. In order to put you back under the yoke which you have broken, and so that you would think that you were returning there of your own volition, they placed corrupt men in all public offices, men who are as skillful as they are perverse, men capable of turning the power that they had been given to defend and strengthen the people's liberty against that very liberty." Persecutions of the clergy were resumed. The policy of maintaining occupied sister republics, particularly in the Low Counties, Italy and Switzerland, would begin and be exacerbated after Napoleon's 18th Brumaire, both as a bulwark against the newly reignited Franco-Austrian and Franco-British rivalries, also to export liberté and égalité abroad, and ultimately to turn them into kleptocracies for the war effort against the European coalitions. In this tumultuous background lies the story of Friedrich von Gentz, a Prussian liberal who was to become a staunch Austrian counter-revolutionary and a pivotal man in inspiring the German campaign of 1813, as a plenipotentiary of the Congress of Vienna, as enforcing order in the Danubian principalities lying between Russian and Ottoman influence, and upholding legitimism above all potential usurpers and seditionists. His two main works from the 1800s are relevant here. On the State of Europe before and after the French Revolution, 1804, and Fragments upon the Balance of Power in Europe, 1806. These books are unique, but by no means unconventional in their views for the time, in that Gentz manages to synthesize Westphalian legal rationalism with a conservative legitimist internationalism later defining the concert of Europe, while still emphasizing a place for national identity and self-determination. By the 1810s, however, he would become more thoroughly meta-Nietzschean, operating largely in Vienna from 1809 onward, and sneer at liberal demands for self-determination. By the 1820s and 1830s, his conversion to counter-revolution was absolutely rabid, as is evident from his letters attacking Chateaubriand for being too moderate and developing a deep appreciation for Joseph de Maistre. Thus, Gentz's works in the 1800s were transitional, and his estrangement from his youthly principles ever-growing. Let us see. In a letter to Christian Garve dated 15th of October 1790, he could write regarding the French Revolution, "The log of this revolution has been one of the hardest crashes ever to have affected the human race. It is the first practical triumph of philosophy, the first example of a form of government based on principles and a coherent, consistent system. It is the hope and consolation for so many old evils under which humanity sighs." He adds that, even in light of unrest and excesses, that the prospects for the future are more cheerful than the enemies portray them. 2 years later, he was translating Edmund Burke's Reflections into German, and moving on to monarchians like Jean-Joseph Mounier and Jacques Mallet Dupin. Mallet Dupin was undoubtedly an incendiary critic and condemned the militancy and fiscal debasement of the revolutionists. Thus, to pillage and plunder either at home or abroad is now the law, the very condition of existence for the new world sprung up from the dregs and filth of Paris. 4,500 million in assignats infest the circulation, and they will amount to 5,000 million before the end of the year. Does anyone imagine that the revolutionists trouble their heads about their liquidation? No such thing, and no such liquidation could take place without great prejudice to one of their most essential projects, that of dividing amongst the conquerors the conquered mortgage lands, and to prolong the attachment of the people by exempting them from all taxes. These two operations require that a portion of the fortunes of the émigrés and of others yet to be confiscated should be divided between the soldiers and the inferior agents of the Republic. This has been already energetically demanded in the sections, in the clubs, and in the Commune of Paris, and the Convention by a late decree has already settled the first lots. The remainder of the lands thus usurped will serve for the estate of the nation, and its produce will form the revenue of the Republic, and it will stand in the place of taxes which are no more to be proposed to an armed and sovereign people. How Gentz must have nodded. Having wiped out a good chunk of his youthful follies, Gentz developed a certain form of German nationalism in the 1800s that was neither liberal nor Volkish. Let us look at a statement from a letter to Prince Adam Czartoryski in 1806. "I am not an Austrian, a Prussian, an Englishman, or a Russian. At the same time, may God keep me from being a cosmopolitan, a term which I abhor above all others, and which I regard as a real insult. I am a German, and I am German in every sense of the word. The liberty, the prosperity, and the glory of Germany. These, in a nutshell, are the objectives that lie closest to my heart. Since, however, these objectives in the present situation are so closely connected with the common good of Europe, that Germany has not a single real interest that is not at the same time the interest of all its neighbours, and since anything that restores and sustains Germany also restores and sustains the entire social order, it is clear that no partisan or equivocal motive can ever guide me in my researches. To many people, Gentz's beliefs at the time would appear crypto-globalist. This is a very gross and chauvinistic error to make. Gentz's patriotism, combined with a concern for a flourishing international order, reflects a deep lineage of Christian political thought. Therefore, the greatly Christian writer Eusebius of Caesarea, 263–339, in Book the 4th, Chapter 14 of Life of Constantine, could allude to this idea of a sacerdotal empire. Thus, the nations of the world, being everywhere guided in their course, as it were, by the skill of a single pilot, and acquiescing in the administration of him who governed as the servant of God, the peace of the Roman Empire continued undisturbed, and all classes of his subjects enjoyed a life of tranquillity and repose. At the same time, the emperor, who was convinced that the prayers of godly men contributed powerfully to the maintenance of the public welfare, felt himself constrained zealously to seek such prayers, and not only himself implored the help and favour of God, but charged the prelates of the churches to offer supplications on his behalf. Many centuries later, the great Russian philosopher and theologian Vladimir Solovyov would lament in Russia and the Universal Church that the modern nations, having shattered the papal monarchy, which was the foundation of this imperfect but genuine unity, have had to substitute for the ideal of Catholic Christendom the fiction of the European balance of power. On all hands it is recognized, whether sincerely or not, that the true objective of international politics must be universal peace. Two equally obvious facts, then, are to be noted. First, that there exists a general consciousness of the solidarity of mankind and a desire for international unity, for the Pax Christiana, or, if you will, the Pax Humana. Secondly, that this unity does not exist in fact, and that the first of the three problems of society is as far from being solved at the present day as it was in the ancient world. Even in modern nations, this vision would take a while to die out. As late as 1681, the maverick French absolutist Jacques Bening Bossuet could still write a work in the old genre of universal history, and to promote frugality and labour as virtues, using the Romans as an illustration. They raised the livestock, worked the land, denied themselves as much as they could, and lived by thrift and hard work. That was their life, and that is how they supported their families, whom they brought up to similar occupations. All things considered, though an ostensible balance of power realist, Gentz was more, particularly in his later life. To begin, on his main writings from the 1800s. Firstly, a justification for intervening to abort revolutions. I do not conceive it to be universally true that a nation has no right to interfere in the domestic affairs of any other, and I trust I shall not be singular in regarding it as liable to great exceptions.